He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His voice dropped to a near whisper. You have no idea what's going on in my head, Layla. I stood frozen by the kitchen counter, my fingers gripping the edge so tightly it hurt. His eyes were boring into me, heavy and unrelenting. My thoughts raced, scrambling for a way to make sense of this. This was my stepfather, David, the man who had been a part of our family for 10 years. He was supposed to be solid, dependable, the kind of person you never had to question. But now, David, you're acting weird, I said, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel it tremble underneath. His expression hardened. He leaned in, his face close enough that I couldn't avoid his gaze. Weird? Or are you just afraid to admit you feel the same? I couldn't breathe for a moment. His words hit me like a punch, and for a split second, I didn't know how to react. My chest tightened, and a sinking feeling spread through me. Was this really happening? What are you talking about? I finally managed to say, my voice sharper now. Whatever you think is going on, it's not. I tried to push past him, but he didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. Don't play dumb, Layla. I've seen the way you look at me. The room felt like it was closing in. My heart was racing so fast it hurt, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. You're wrong, I said firmly, but even I wasn't sure I believed it. Something about his words, about this entire situation, left me feeling unsteady. I hated it. David didn't back off. He stayed rooted in place, his tone low and unervingly calm. Am I? Because I think you've been trying to hide it, just like I have. But we can't keep pretending, Layla. Not anymore. I stared at him, my mind screaming at me to shut this down, to do something. But I couldn't move. His words had created a crack in the air between us, and it was growing wider with every passing second. Stop it, I said, my voice louder now, more forceful. You're making something out of nothing. Just stop. For a moment, he looked like he might. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flickered with doubt. But then he leaned in closer, and I knew I wasn't going to like what came next. Tell me you don't feel it too, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Look me in the eye and tell me I'm wrong. I froze again. My throat felt dry, and I couldn't force the words out. I hated myself for hesitating, for letting him think even for a second that this was okay. David, you're crossing a line, I said, each word deliberate. Whatever this is, it stops now. His face twisted, like he was battling something inside himself. For a moment, I thought he'd step back, that this would be the end of it. But instead, he stayed where he was, his eyes locked on mine. You think I don't know that? He said, his voice breaking slightly. You think I don't know how wrong this is? But I can't stop thinking about you. I've tried. I've tried to ignore it, to bury it, but it's there. Every time I look at you, it's there. His words hit like a sledgehammer, and for a moment, I felt like I might fall over. My mind raced, trying to process what he'd just said. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I don't want to hear this, I said, my voice shaking. You need to leave. Now. David didn't move. He stayed there, his eyes searching mine, and I hated how vulnerable he looked. Like he was pleading with me. Layla, I'm not trying to hurt you, he said softly. I'm just tired of lying to myself. I shook my head, stepping back and putting more distance between us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. This conversation is over, I said, my voice cold. Don't bring it up again. Ever. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, he said, his tone laced with frustration. But don't act like I'm the only one struggling here. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just turned and walked out of the kitchen, my legs shaking with every step. My mind was spinning, and I felt like I was walking through a fog. How had things gotten to this point? How had I not seen this coming? But one thing was clear, whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. And deep down, I knew it was only going to get worse. Dramatically worse. After that evening, the atmosphere between us changed. David kept his distance as best as he could, yet the shift was unmistakable. Every glance, every moment of silence in the house, carried a weight that had not been there before. I noticed that his eyes lingered on me longer, and the quiet in our home became heavier with every passing day. I realized that even though he tried to withdraw, the boundary between us had been crossed. I replayed our earlier conversation in my mind, the uncertain tone, the conflict in his eyes, and the way he hesitated between duty and desire. I couldn't help but wonder what he truly felt. The unspoken tension drove me to test the limits further. I needed to know if his distance was genuine or just a cover for the emotions he was fighting. One evening, when Mom had left us alone for work, I sensed an opportunity to push the situation forward. The house was silent, devoid of the usual background noise that masked our thoughts. I decided it was time to take action rather than wait for him to make the next move. I put on a playlist of upbeat songs, tracks that I knew would fill the kitchen with sound and energy. As the music played, I began to prepare dinner, moving purposefully through the kitchen. I chopped vegetables, stirred the sauce, and even allowed myself a few light, deliberate steps that mimicked dancing. Every motion was measured and clear. I wanted to show that I was in control of my own actions and feelings. Soon enough, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. David entered the kitchen carrying a glass of water. He paused in the doorway, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on me as if he was unsure whether to speak or retreat. The moment was tense, and the air between us felt charged with unspoken questions. "You're acting strange," he said, his voice low and cautious. He didn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on some point beyond me, as if he were trying to shield himself from the truth. I turned toward him and raised an eyebrow, allowing a small, defiant smile to form on my lips. "Why? Because I'm finally acting the way I want?" I replied, my tone even but laced with a challenge. I kept my words short and direct, refusing to let the moment spiral into vague sentimentality. David set the glass down on the counter with deliberate care before stepping further into the room. His movements were hesitant, as though each step was weighed against a rule he wasn't ready to break. We stood there for a moment in silence, the noise of the music contrasting sharply with the quiet tension between us. "Layla, you know this isn't right," he said, his voice lacking the firmness I expected. There was uncertainty in his tone, a clear indication that he was wrestling with the situation internally. His eyes, however, betrayed a deeper conflict. They seemed to plead for an explanation even as he tried to uphold his own boundaries. I took a step closer, reducing the distance between us. My voice dropped to a quieter tone, measured and calm. "If it's wrong, why are you still here?" I asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the choices we both had made. I wasn't accusing him. I was seeking the truth in a situation where truth had become elusive. For several seconds, David said nothing. I watched as his eyes flickered with inner turmoil. His hand clenched slightly at his side, and it was clear he was holding his breath, caught between what he felt and what he believed was acceptable. The silence stretched on, and every second seemed to intensify the conflict between us. The hum of the music, the soft clatter of utensils, and even the ticking of the wall clock faded into the background as I focused solely on him. I could see the internal battle playing out on his face. In that charged moment, everything around us seemed to pause, waiting for his next move. Then, David's expression shifted ever so slightly. His eyes locked onto mine, and I sensed that he was about to say something that could change everything. The hesitation in his posture deepened, and I instinctively took another step forward, closing the gap between us. I wanted to break the silence, to force him to confront the reality of our situation. I needed him to decide whether to continue down this dangerous path or to retreat back into the familiar confines of his own rules. He took an unsteady step forward as well, and for a moment, we were nearly face to face. His breathing grew shallow, and the conflict in his eyes intensified. There was no further explanation, no additional words. He simply held his breath, caught in the grip of a decision he could not yet make. And in that charged moment, as our eyes locked and the tension reached its peak, I realized something crucial. He held his breath, and I realized that I could no longer stop. We both knew we were playing with fire. Over the past few days, David began spending more time alone in his room. He deliberately avoided any direct contact with me, and every time our paths crossed, his eyes would drop quickly. Despite his withdrawal, I refused to let him hide behind his silence. That evening, I decided it was time to address the growing distance. I waited until the house was quiet and made my way to his study. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with only a desk lamp providing a small pool of light on scattered papers. David sat behind his desk, his gaze fixed on the window. I cleared my throat and broke the silence. "Why are you avoiding me?" I asked directly, standing at the doorway. He didn't look up immediately. After a moment, he replied in a low voice, "Because I don't want to do something I'll regret later." His response was measured but unsatisfying. I closed the door behind me, signaling that this conversation was not going to end until we both faced it. I moved closer, watching him carefully. His eyes remained on the window, but I could sense his inner conflict. And what if I don't regret it? I pressed, my tone even but insistent. At my words, he abruptly lifted his head. I caught a glimpse of uncertainty and struggle in his eyes, a battle between his reason and his desires. He hesitated, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet in the room was heavy, filled with all the things left unsaid. I took a few steps forward until I reached the edge of his desk. I sat down, leaning forward slightly as if to bridge the gap between us. My posture was relaxed yet determined. I needed him to understand that avoiding the truth wouldn't make it disappear. "Layla, this has gone too far," he said softly, though his voice lacked the conviction of someone who truly believed it. It was as if he was trying to convince himself rather than me. His eyes darted away for a moment before returning to mine. I maintained eye contact and leaned even closer. "And what if it is exactly what is needed?" I asked, my voice quiet but unwavering. His brow furrowed as he struggled with his next words. He set his pen down slowly and rested his hands on the desk. I could see that he was weighing his options, torn between duty and a desire that he found hard to deny. The tension in the room was palpable, and every second seemed to stretch out longer than the last. I don't know," he finally murmured, his voice barely audible. "We can't keep doing this. It's dangerous, for both of us." I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in determination. Dangerous or not, we've already crossed a line. You can't just retreat back into your room and pretend nothing happened. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze finally locking with mine. "It's not that simple. I'm trying to protect us from something we might not be ready for. Ready or not, feelings don't just vanish because we want them to," I countered. I kept my tone factual, not overly emotional, yet every word was loaded with the truth of our situation. Avoiding me isn't the answer, David. We need to confront this head-on, or it will only get worse. David's eyes searched mine, filled with uncertainty. For a moment, the conflict between us was clear. The part of him that wanted to give in and the part that feared the consequences of that choice. He shifted in his seat, his expression hard to read. "Layla, I'm not sure what the right thing is anymore," he admitted. "Every time I think about it, I worry about hurting you, hurting us." I leaned back slightly, considering his words. I understood his fear, yet I also knew that avoiding our issues would only build more resentment and confusion. "Maybe it's not about what's right or wrong," I said slowly. "Maybe it's about accepting what we feel and dealing with the consequences. We've already reached a point where denial isn't an option." David's gaze softened, and he sighed deeply. The moment stretched as he considered his next words carefully. His inner battle was evident, and I waited patiently, knowing that the decision we faced could change everything. After a long pause, he looked up again, determination mixed with apprehension in his eyes. "I want to believe that we can handle this," he said, his voice steadier now. "But I'm scared that once we take this step, nothing will ever be the same." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "Sometimes, change is inevitable," I replied simply. "We have to decide if we're willing to face it together." As I leaned in closer, challenging both his doubts and my own, the air between us felt charged with the promise of a turning point. In that silent, tense moment, our unspoken agreement hung in the balance, one that could lead us down a path from which there might be no return. The tension between us had reached its peak. One evening, while Mom was at work, I entered his room. David sat on the edge of the bed, holding a book in his hands, but it was clear his thoughts were far away. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the silence in the room heavy and expectant. "We can't ignore this anymore," I said firmly, breaking the quiet as I met his gaze. He slowly looked up, his eyes uncertain as if deciding whether to give in or to flee. After a brief pause, he replied in a low, measured tone, "Layla, we can't do this." There was hesitation in his voice, a clear sign he was struggling to hold on to the boundaries he had set. I stepped further into the room and sat down beside him on the edge of the bed. I noticed his breathing had deepened and his hand trembled slightly on the book. I wanted to show him, but I was not going to let this moment slip away without confronting it. "You already said that," I replied, looking him directly in the eye. My tone was calm and steady. I wasn't here to argue, but to face the reality of our situation. David raised his hand as if he intended to reach out to me, but he stopped just before his fingers could bridge the gap between us. He looked down for a moment and then whispered, "I shouldn't be doing this." His words hung between us, laden with uncertainty and regret. I leaned in closer, my gaze never wavering from his. "And what if you must?" I asked quietly, my voice firm and challenging. The simplicity of the question belied its significance. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the steady tick of the clock and his slow, uneven breaths. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can control it," he admitted. "Every time I try to keep my distance, I end up thinking about you, about us. I'm afraid that if I give in, everything will change forever." I listened intently. The idea of control had always been a comfort to him, yet in this moment, it was slipping away. "Control is an illusion," I said gently. "We are who we are, and if you feel this is right, then maybe you need to let go of that fear. Running away will only make things worse." He looked at me, his eyes filled with conflict. "But what about the consequences?" he asked. "If we continue down this path, it might destroy everything we have. I'm scared of hurting you and myself in the process." I took a deep breath before answering. "Consequences are part of any decision we make," I replied. "We already live with the fallout of our choices. The real question is, do we have the strength to face it together? Or will we keep hiding behind our fears and pretenses?" I paused, letting the weight of my words settle between us. We can't undo what's happened. The line has been crossed, and now we have to decide how to move forward. David shifted on the bed, and I saw the tension in his posture intensify. "I'm scared, Layla," he confessed. "I'm scared of losing control, of making a mistake we can't recover from. I want to do what's right, but I'm not sure what that is anymore." I reached out and placed my hand gently on his. "I understand your fear," I said, keeping my tone neutral and sincere. "I'm scared too. But if we keep avoiding what we feel, the fear will only grow. We need to be honest about our emotions, even if it means facing difficult truths." He glanced at my hand on his before meeting my eyes again. "How do we even begin to fix this?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "How do we mend something that feels so broken?" I considered his question for a moment. "We start by talking," I said slowly. "We acknowledge that things have changed and that we can't simply pretend nothing is wrong. It won't be easy, and there will be hard conversations ahead, but it's the only way forward. We must accept the consequences of our actions, no matter how difficult they may be." David's eyes remained locked on mine, the conflict within him evident. "I need time to think about all of this," he said quietly. "I need to figure out what I'm willing to risk and what I'm not. I need to understand if this is something we can handle or if it's a mistake waiting to happen." "I understand," I replied. "Take all the time you need. But every moment we spend in silence only makes it harder. I'm not asking for an immediate decision. I'm just saying we can't ignore what's between us any longer. We have to face it head on, or it will continue to haunt us." He looked down at his hands and then back at me, his eyes searching for a sign of resolve. "Maybe we should set some boundaries," he suggested cautiously. "Define what we can handle and what might be too dangerous to risk." "Boundaries could help," I agreed. "They would give us a structure to understand our feelings and actions. But they'll only work if we're both honest about our limits." I paused, ensuring my words were clear. We have to decide what we're comfortable with, knowing that our lives may never return to what they once were. He sighed deeply, his eyes betraying both fear and determination. "I can't keep running away from this, Layla," he admitted. "I'm tired of pretending everything is fine when it isn't." At that moment, I leaned even closer, repeating the challenge that had sparked this conversation. "And what if you must?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, charged with the weight of every decision we had yet to make. In that quiet, charged moment, both of us realized that our next step would change everything. We were at a crossroads, caught between the fear of the unknown and the certainty that our lives would never be the same if we continued to ignore our true feelings. The decision now rested with him, and I could only hope he would choose to face the truth rather than retreat into silence. And with that, the room fell silent once more, leaving us both to confront the reality of our situation and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The moment we both feared had arrived. I was in David's room, and the charged silence between us made every second feel critical. We had been dancing around this forbidden boundary for too long, and now it was here, inevitable and raw. David's eyes were fixed on mine as he slowly extended his hand. His fingers grazed my cheek, and in that brief contact, I saw something inside him break. It was as if all the barriers he had maintained crumbled in that instant. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. I felt his warm breath on my skin as he leaned in, and the space between us seemed to vanish. "You have no idea how much I've wanted this," he said in a low, strained voice. His words were direct and unadorned, yet they carried the weight of years of suppressed desire and conflict. I looked into his eyes and felt a pull, but I could no longer resist. With steady determination, I stepped toward him, ready to close the final gap. Every part of me knew that taking this step meant accepting the consequences of a truth we had both tried so hard to ignore. But in that moment, nothing else mattered except the raw honesty of our feelings. Just as I was about to meet him, a sudden, loud knock shattered the fragile intimacy. "David? Layla? Are you home?" The unmistakable sound of my mother's voice echoed through the room. In that instant, time seemed to freeze. We both stood still, caught in a moment that was as dangerous as it was revealing. David quickly retracted his hand from my cheek, his eyes darting away as if the shock of the interruption had forced him to retreat. I, too, stepped back abruptly, my heart racing with the realization that our carefully guarded secret was now exposed. The room, which moments before had been filled with a private intensity, now felt stifling and confining under the weight of impending consequences. The knock sounded again, louder and more insistent, followed by the unmistakable click of the door opening. My mother's figure appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as they took in the scene before her. There was no warmth in her gaze, only suspicion and an unspoken command for answers. "Mom," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "We can explain," but she cut me off with a sharp shake of her head. Her eyes moved slowly from David to me, and in that gaze, I could see the realization that our secret was far more than a private mistake. It was a betrayal of the boundaries we had all once taken for granted. David's face was stricken with regret and anxiety as he avoided her gaze. He seemed to be struggling for words, caught between the need to explain and the fear of making things worse. For a long, heavy moment, silence filled the room. The clock ticked steadily, marking time in a way that made every second feel like an eternity. "How long has this been going on?" my mother demanded, her tone sharp and unyielding. Her question left no room for vague responses or half-truths. I could see that she was already piecing together the evidence of our actions, and now she expected a full account. I glanced at David, silently urging him to speak first, but he hesitated. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "We didn't plan for this to happen. It just did." My words were simple, intended to diffuse the tension, yet they did little to mask the gravity of our situation. I knew that this explanation was inadequate, but it was all I could manage in that moment of raw exposure. My mother's eyes narrowed further. "Explain," she insisted, stepping further into the room. Her voice was calm, but laced with a firmness that left no room for denial. "I need to know exactly what happened here." Her question hung in the air, and I could feel the pressure of its demand. David finally spoke, his voice quiet and measured. "I never meant for it to go this far," he admitted. "I was confused and overwhelmed, and I lost control." His words were factual, devoid of the embellishments that might have softened the blow, and I saw the pain in his eyes as he spoke. It was clear that both of us were facing a reality that could not be undone. My mother took a moment to absorb his words, her gaze flickering between us. "This is unacceptable," she stated, her voice low and firm. "You both need to understand that actions have consequences." Her words cut through the room, leaving no doubt about her disappointment and the seriousness of the situation. I looked at David, and in his eyes, I saw a mixture of regret and resignation. There was no defiance left, only the acknowledgement that our lives were about to change in ways we could no longer control. The intimate act that we had shared was no longer a private moment, but a turning point that threatened to upend everything. In that charged silence, I stepped back from David, my mind racing with the implications of our actions. I could feel the heavy weight of every decision that had led us to this moment. Our forbidden touch, once a secret spark between us, had now ignited a chain reaction that promised to alter our futures irrevocably. I stood there, caught between fear and an odd sense of inevitability, knowing that there was no going back. The intimacy we had shared was a truth that we could no longer hide, and my mother's presence only underscored the finality of the moment. We were standing at the edge of a precipice, and the next step we took would determine everything. My mother's eyes never left us as she waited for an explanation. The tension in the room was palpable, and every second felt like it stretched into an eternity. The forbidden touch, the stolen moment of passion, was now laid bare for all to see. It was a point of no return, a moment when the consequences of our actions would come crashing down. I could feel the heat of the moment still lingering, the memory of his hand on my cheek and his breath on my skin etched into my mind. That memory was now tainted by the sound of my mother's voice and the shock in David's eyes. As we stood there, Facing the harsh reality of our situation, I knew that everything was about to change. With my mother's stern gaze fixed on us, I realized that the next few moments would define our future. The intimacy we had dared to share, the unspoken promise of something that could never be undone, was now a burden we had to bear. And as I looked into David's eyes, I saw in them a silent acknowledgement that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In that final, tense moment, with our secret exposed and our futures uncertain, I knew that our lives would never be the same. The forbidden had become our reality, and now we had to face the consequences head-on, no matter the cost.